I am Russell Cole, a 62-year-old retired structural engineer, and yesterday I systematically dismantled my only son's life. It all started with a single text message. My son Cameron wrote, "Do not come to the wedding tomorrow. Vanessa is too stressed by your presence. We want our space." I read the message while physically holding my platinum card, preparing to pay the $45,000 catering deposit for that exact wedding. I did not text back. I simply walked out to my truck, drained his $82,000 checking account, and canceled every credit card in his wallet. Before I tell you exactly how I executed this financial demolition, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe disrespect should always carry a heavy price. Now let me take you back to that moment in the climate-controlled office of the Peninsula Country Club. The catering director sat across from me behind a massive mahogany desk, tapping his expensive pen against a leather-bound contract. He was smiling, the kind of smile reserved for people about to hand over a massive sum of money. The final balance for Cameron and Vanessa's wedding reception was exactly $45,200. I had my wallet open. My platinum card was pinched between my fingers. I was fully prepared to fund the lavish 6-course dinner, the premium open bar, and the midnight dessert buffet that Vanessa had aggressively demanded. That was the exact moment my phone vibrated in my chest pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a last-minute question about the seating chart. Instead, I saw Cameron's name. The message was brief, sterile, and entirely cowardly. "Do not come to the wedding tomorrow. Vanessa is too stressed by your presence. We want our space." I stared at the glowing screen. I did not feel a sudden rush of tears. I did not feel the urge to call him and beg for an explanation. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me. For 5 years, ever since my wife Diane passed away from ovarian cancer, I had been the silent ATM funding Cameron's entire existence. I paid for his luxury apartment. I paid the leases on their cars. I bankrolled this entire 6-figure wedding because he claimed his tech startup was just going through a rough patch. He had taken my money for years, and now less than 24 hours before the ceremony, his future wife had decided my presence would ruin her aesthetic. And my son had let her do it. The catering director cleared his throat, holding out a silver tray for my credit card. He asked if there was a problem. I looked at him. I slid my platinum card back into its leather slot. I closed my wallet and put it in my pocket. I told him the Cole event was canceled due to a complete lack of funding. The director's smile vanished. He stammered, reminding me that the wedding was tomorrow afternoon. He warned me that canceling now meant forfeiting the $10,000 initial deposit. He said the kitchen had already prepped the Wagyu beef, and the floral arrangements were currently being loaded onto the delivery trucks. I stood up from the leather chair. I told him I did not care about the deposit, and I told him to throw the beef in the garbage. I walked out of the office, ignoring his panicked protests echoing down the hallway. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun and walked across the asphalt to my truck. I climbed inside, shut the heavy door, and started the engine just to get the air conditioning running. I did not drive away immediately. I pulled my phone back out and opened my primary banking application. When Diane died, Cameron came to me weeping. He said he was lost, that he needed a safety net while he figured out his career. Against my better judgment, I had opened a high-yield joint checking account to serve as his emergency fund. Over the years, I kept it heavily padded. He used it as his personal slush fund, draining it for vacations, designer clothes, and expensive dinners, always promising to pay me back when his business took off. It never did, and I always replenished the funds out of a misplaced sense of fatherly duty. I tapped on the joint account. The current balance was $82,450. I did not freeze the account. Freezing it would give him the opportunity to call the bank cry to a manager and potentially unlock it by claiming financial hardship. Instead, I executed an immediate wire transfer. I moved the entire $82,000 into a private offshore trust I had established years ago during my engineering career. It was a trust Cameron did not know about, could not access, and could never legally touch. I watched the loading circle spin on my screen. 3 seconds later, a green checkmark appeared. The joint account balance dropped to 0. I was not finished. I navigated to the credit card portal. Cameron carried 2 premium metal credit cards. He liked to drop them on the table at expensive restaurants to impress his friends. What he conveniently forgot, or simply chose to ignore, was that he was merely an authorized user. I was the primary guarantor. My name, my credit score, and my income secured those lines of credit. I clicked on the transaction history. I saw the pending charges from the last 48 hours. There was a $12,000 charge for first-class tickets to the Maldives for their honeymoon. There was a $4,000 charge at a luxury spa that Vanessa had visited just yesterday. They were spending my money while actively planning to ban me from the venue. I did not just click the digital lock button on the app. That was too temporary. I dialed the fraud department directly. A representative answered after 2 rings. I verified my identity, gave my social security number, and recited my security PIN. I told the representative that the 2 physical cards in Cameron's possession were compromised. I reported them as stolen. The representative immediately canceled the card numbers and offered to overnight replacement cards to my home address. I politely declined. I instructed the bank to permanently close those specific authorized user lines. I demanded a hard lock on the account, ensuring no new cards could be issued without my physical presence in a bank branch. The representative confirmed the action. The plastic in Cameron's wallet was now entirely useless. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. I put the truck in drive and pulled out of the country club parking lot. My mind was already calculating the timeline of the impending disaster. It was currently 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Tonight at 7, they were hosting a massive rehearsal dinner at an upscale seafood restaurant downtown. Cameron would undoubtedly try to pay the bill with the metal credit card. It would decline. He would then try to log into the checking account to use his debit card. He would see a balance of 0. He would panic. He would call the country club to see if the catering was paid, for only to discover the entire reception had been canceled. They wanted space. They wanted a life without my presence. I was simply granting their wish. I was removing my presence and along with it the financial foundation that kept their entire fake world from collapsing. I drove home in complete silence, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and waited for the inevitable explosion on my front porch. The pounding on my front door started at exactly 7 in the morning. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, aggressive hammering of people whose entire world had just caught fire. I was already awake. I was sitting at my kitchen island, drinking a cup of black coffee, watching the security camera feed on my tablet. I watched my son Cameron and his fiancée Vanessa pacing on my front porch. Vanessa was still wearing her expensive silk pajamas and oversized sunglasses, clutching her designer purse like a life preserver. Cameron looked pale and sleep-deprived. He kept hitting the doorbell while simultaneously pounding his fist against the heavy oak wood. I took one last sip of my coffee. I did not rush. I walked slowly down the hallway, feeling the cool hardwood under my feet. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before the door was even fully ajar, Vanessa shoved her hand into the gap. She was waving the metal credit card right in my face. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with panic. She screamed that the florist was currently standing in the hotel ballroom, threatening to pack up $10,000 worth of imported white orchids. She said the final payment had bounced. She demanded to know why the card was declining and told me I was ruining the most important morning of her life. She did not say good morning. She did not apologize for the text message telling me I was banned from this very wedding. She simply demanded my money. Cameron stepped forward, trying to push his future wife behind him. He looked at me with a mixture of irritation and embarrassment. He told me there was a glitch with the bank. He ordered me to get my phone and call the fraud department immediately to clear the hold. He spoke to me not as a father, but as a negligent employee who had messed up his payroll. He actually snapped his fingers at me, telling me to hurry up, because the caterers were going to try running the card again in 15 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I did not ask him why I was uninvited from watching my only son get married. I looked at Cameron, and then I looked at Vanessa. The sheer audacity of their presence on my property, demanding my resources after discarding me, was a spectacle of pure entitlement. I reached to the small console table sitting just inside my entryway. Last night, while they were presumably panicking at their rehearsal dinner over declining cards, I had been busy printing. I picked up a thick, heavy manila envelope and held it out to my son. Cameron stopped snapping his fingers. He looked at the envelope confused. He asked me what it was and if it was a cashier's check to cover the floral emergency. I did not answer. I simply kept my hand extended until he took it. He ripped open the flap and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. It was an itemized invoice. I had stayed up until 2 a.m. combing through 3 years of bank statements. Every single dollar I had spent subsidizing his illusion of success was documented on those pages. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the confusion morph into absolute horror. I had listed the $3,200 monthly rent for his luxury downtown condo. I had listed the $900 monthly lease for his imported sedan. I had listed the $4,000 custom-tailored suit he bought for a business pitch that never materialized. I documented the $12,000 first-class tickets to the Maldives for a honeymoon I was not allowed to hear about. I listed the groceries, the utility bills, the spontaneous cash transfers, and the expensive dinners. At the very bottom of the final page was the total sum: $214,612. Stamped diagonally across the final number in bright red ink were 2 words: funds terminated. Cameron looked up from the papers. The color had completely drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked back down at the paper, as if the numbers might magically change if he stared hard enough. Vanessa snatched the papers out of his hands. She scanned the document, her eyes darting back and forth. She did not understand the gravity of the situation at first. She looked at me and yelled, asking what this garbage was and why I was giving them a math assignment when the florist was threatening to leave. I finally spoke. My voice was calm and steady. I told Cameron that the bank glitch was not a glitch. I told him the accounts were closed. I told him the credit cards were reported stolen and permanently canceled. I informed him that the financial umbilical cord had been cut, and he was now officially an independent adult. Cameron stumbled backward a step. He finally registered the reality of the situation. He stammered, trying to formulate an excuse. He brought up the text message. He said Vanessa was just feeling overwhelmed with the wedding planning and that the text was a mistake. He said they wanted me there and that I was overreacting to a momentary lapse in judgment. I told him I was not overreacting. I was simply granting their request. They wanted space from my presence. I was giving them permanent space. But my money and my presence were a package deal. They could not banish the man and keep the wallet. Vanessa's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. The realization that her lavish wedding, her expensive orchids, and her luxury honeymoon were evaporating into thin air made her snap. She screamed that I was a vindictive old monster. She said I was trying to financially abuse them to maintain control. She lunged forward, trying to push past me into the house. I do not know if she intended to hit me, or if she was trying to get inside to find my phone and call the bank herself. I did not let her find out. I stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door directly in her face. The sound of the thick wood hitting the frame echoed loudly in the quiet morning air. I immediately reached up and turned the brass deadbolt, locking it securely into place. I stood in the entryway and listened. Muffled through the thick wood, I could hear Vanessa screaming at the top of her lungs. I heard her kicking the bottom of the door, leaving scuff marks on the pristine white paint. I heard Cameron shouting at her to stop, followed by him begging me through the wood to just open the door and talk about this like a family. I did not respond. I walked away from the door and went back to my kitchen. I picked up my tablet and watched them on the security feed. Vanessa was crying hysterically, sitting on the porch steps, holding her head in her hands. Cameron was pacing wildly, pulling his hair and staring at the itemized invoice scattered across my welcome mat. They stayed there for another 5 minutes before Cameron's phone rang. It was undoubtedly the hotel manager or the caterer demanding their money. Cameron looked at his phone, looked at my locked door, and then grabbed Vanessa by the arm. They ran to their car and sped out of my driveway, tires squealing on the asphalt. The ambush had failed. The real consequences were only just beginning. The house was incredibly quiet after they sped away. I walked over to the sink and rinsed my coffee mug, watching the water swirl down the drain. Exactly 1 hour passed before the silence was broken. My cell phone began to vibrate against the granite countertop. I looked at the caller ID and saw the main office number for the Grand Magnolia Hotel. This was the luxury venue where they were supposed to host their 500-guest reception later that evening. I answered the phone and was greeted by the strained voice of the general manager, Michael. He apologized for bothering me on a Saturday morning, but said he had a rapidly escalating situation in his main lobby. Michael explained that Cameron and Vanessa had just stormed up to the concierge desk. After discovering that the country club catering had been entirely canceled, they decided to pivot. Cameron was currently demanding that the Grand Magnolia kitchen staff take over the catering for the entire event. He was loudly throwing my name around, trying to leverage the Cole family discount to force the hotel into absorbing the massive sudden cost. Cameron assumed I was just a preferred member at the hotel. He thought my name simply carried VIP status because I booked a lot of corporate events there before I retired. He was entirely unaware of the actual reality. 10 years ago, during the peak of my engineering career, I did not just buy a membership to the Magnolia. I led a private investment group that saved the entire hospitality management company from bankruptcy. I currently owned a 30% stake in the hotel and the 3 luxury resorts affiliated with it. I sat on the board of directors. Michael did not just respect me as a guest. He reported directly to me. I listened to Michael as he described Cameron banging his fist on the marble counter, demanding that the executive chef drop everything and prepare a new menu. Vanessa was apparently standing behind him, crying loudly to gather sympathy from the other wealthy patrons in the lobby. They were trying to manipulate the staff into providing a 6-figure service for free simply because they carried my last name. I gave Michael very clear and precise instructions. I told him that under no circumstances was the hotel to provide a single appetizer for that wedding. I told him to log into the billing system and completely revoke the Cole family discount code from Cameron's reservation. I instructed him to recalculate the cost of the grand ballroom rental at the maximum premium weekend rate. Then I told him to present that new inflated bill to my son and demand payment in full immediately. I specified that the hotel was not to accept any personal checks or promises of future wire transfers. The only acceptable form of payment would be a certified cashier's check handed over right there at the front desk. Michael understood perfectly. I stayed on the line, listening quietly as he set the phone down and walked out to the front desk. Through the receiver, I could hear the faint echo of the massive lobby. I heard Michael clear his throat and professionally inform Cameron that the family discount had been officially terminated by the account holder. I heard Cameron gasp. I heard Michael explain the new ballroom fee and request immediate payment. Cameron tried to argue. He tried to claim it was illegal. When Michael stood his ground, Cameron confidently pulled out the second metal credit card from his wallet, the one he thought I might have forgotten to cancel. I listened as the front desk agent ran the card through the terminal. A few seconds later, the machine beeped that harsh, flat tone of a declined transaction. Cameron tried another card. Declined again. The reality of his absolute financial ruin was playing out in front of a lobby full of affluent strangers. Vanessa started screaming at the staff, calling them incompetent. That was the moment Michael executed my final instruction. He signaled the hotel security team. 2 large men in dark suits approached Cameron and Vanessa. Michael politely but firmly informed them that since they could not pay for the venue and were causing a public disturbance, they were officially trespassing. I listened with cold satisfaction as my son and his bride-to-be were physically escorted off the marble floors and pushed out through the revolving glass doors into the street. I ended the call and set the phone back on the counter. The venue was gone. The food was gone. The illusion was entirely shattered. 10 minutes later, my phone chirped, indicating a new voicemail. I did not even hear it ring. Vanessa must have called and bypassed the ringer directly to leave a message. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker. Her voice filled my kitchen. She was no longer trying to sound like a victim. She sounded venomous and unhinged. She called me every vile name she could think of. She blamed me for her own humiliation in the hotel lobby. Then she played the only card she thought she had left. She told me that because of what I had done today, I was dead to them. She said when they eventually had children, she would make sure those kids never knew my name. She promised to tell my future grandchildren that their grandfather was a cruel, abusive monster who abandoned his family. She said I would die alone in my empty house and no one would come to my funeral. It is a strange thing to hear someone try to use hypothetical children as a weapon. 5 years ago, that threat might have broken my heart. I might have caved to the pressure out of a desperate fear of losing my family line. But standing in my kitchen after watching them try to steal my money and publicly disrespect me, I felt absolutely nothing. A child raised by two entitled parasites would only learn to be a parasite. I did not want any part of the toxic legacy she was threatening to withhold from me. I waited for the voicemail to finish playing. I did not save it for evidence. I did not forward it to Cameron to show him how evil his future wife was. I simply hit the delete button, erasing her voice from my home. The emotional manipulation had failed, just like the doorstep ambush had failed. It was time to move from defense to offense. They still believed they could salvage their lives using the assets I had blindly trusted Cameron with over the years. I needed to know exactly how much damage my son had done in the shadows while I was grieving my wife. I picked up the phone again and scrolled through my contacts. I bypassed the family numbers and clicked on the direct office line for Vincent Gallagher. Vincent was a ruthless corporate attorney who had handled all my construction firm contracts before I retired. He was not a family lawyer who would try to mediate a peaceful resolution. He was a man who destroyed opposing companies for a living. I needed someone who viewed my son not as a family member, but as a hostile entity attempting a hostile takeover of my life. Vincent answered on the second ring. I told him I had a massive financial emergency and I needed his immediate assistance. I asked him to cancel his weekend plans and come to my house right away. I told him to bring his laptop and secure access to the county registry databases. The severance of the bank accounts was only the surface. I needed to dig up the roots. I told Vincent that Cameron had declared war over a wedding, but I was about to show him what a real scorched earth campaign looked like. Vincent did not ask any emotional questions. He simply asked for my address and said he would be there in 30 minutes. I hung up the phone. I walked into my home office and began pulling out every physical file cabinet drawer. The tears and the screaming were over. The legal execution was about to begin. Vincent arrived at my house exactly 28 minutes after I hung up the phone. He parked his black sedan in my driveway and walked up to my front porch carrying a battered leather briefcase. He did not ring the doorbell. He knocked twice and let himself in. Vincent was not the kind of man who engaged in small talk. He did not ask how I was feeling or offer empty sympathies about my ruined weekend. He walked straight into my home office, set his briefcase on my mahogany desk, and opened his laptop. I stood by the window watching the street just in case Cameron was stupid enough to return. I told Vincent that the bank accounts were closed and the credit cards were dead. But I knew my son. Cameron was backed into a corner, and people like him do not suddenly learn humility when their money runs out. They look for the next easy target. I told Vincent I needed a complete and total audit of every single asset connected to my name. I wanted him to sweep the county registries, the property deeds, and the corporate holding structures. I was worried Cameron might try to leverage my physical properties now that his liquid cash was gone. Vincent did not say a word. He just started typing. The only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of his keyboard. I poured 2 glasses of water and set one next to his laptop. I had spent 30 years building a substantial real estate portfolio before retiring. Most of it was locked behind ironclad corporate trusts that Cameron did not even know existed. But there was one property that remained entirely in my personal name: the lakeside cabin up north. It was the only property Diane and I had bought together just for us. It was supposed to be my sanctuary for retirement. It was the place where I scattered her ashes. It was a place Cameron knew well because he used to spend his childhood summers there. I told Vincent to start the search with the cabin deed. Vincent accessed the county clerk database. He ran a search on the parcel number. I watched his eyes scan the screen. Vincent is a man who has negotiated multi-million-dollar hostile takeovers without blinking. But when the search results populated on his screen, his hands completely stopped moving. He leaned closer to the monitor. He looked up at me and his expression was entirely unreadable. He told me I was right to ask for an audit. He told me he did not find a simple lien or an unpaid tax bill. He found a massive financial catastrophe. Vincent turned the laptop screen toward me. He pointed to a digital document filed with the county recorder exactly 3 months ago. It was an equity loan taken out against the lakeside cabin. The amount was $150,000. The lender was not a reputable national bank. It was a predatory secondary lending company operating out of a strip mall 2 towns over. The kind of place that charges exorbitant interest rates and intentionally approves high-risk loans just to foreclose on valuable properties. I stared at the screen. I asked Vincent how this was possible. I owned the cabin outright. I had not signed a loan document in a decade. Vincent pulled up the supporting documentation attached to the loan file. He opened a scanned digital copy of a power of attorney form. It appointed Cameron Cole as the sole financial agent for Russell Cole, granting him the absolute authority to encumber, sell, or leverage any real estate in my name. The document looked official. It had a notary stamp, and at the bottom of the page, right on the signature line, was my signature. But it was not fresh ink. I leaned closer to the screen, studying the loops and the pressure marks of the signature. I recognized it immediately. It was a flawless, pixel-perfect copy. When Diane was in her final weeks of hospice care, the hospital required dozens of medical directives and end-of-life care forms to be signed. I had been shaking so badly the day I signed the Do Not Resuscitate order that my signature had a very distinct jagged edge on the letter R. I had scanned those documents into our home computer to email them to our insurance provider. Cameron had access to that computer. He had gone into my files, found the darkest moment of my entire life, digitally cropped my trembling signature from his own mother's death paperwork and pasted it onto a fraudulent power of attorney form. He used the memory of my dying wife to steal my retirement sanctuary. Most fathers would have broken down right there. Most men would have grabbed their chest, felt their heart break, and started crying at the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I did not shed a single tear. The initial shock evaporated in less than 3 seconds. What replaced it was a cold, dark, and deeply focused calculation. Vincent asked me if I wanted him to dial 911. He said this was textbook wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. He said we could have a squad car at the hotel venue in 10 minutes to arrest Cameron right in front of his fiancée and whatever guests were still lingering around the lobby. I told him no. I told him we were not calling the police. Not yet. If I called the police, Cameron would be arrested, but the legal mess of clearing the title on my cabin would take years. The predatory lending company would fight me in civil court, claiming they acted in good faith. They would drag it out, hoping I would die or give up before the loan was discharged. I was not going to play defense. I was going to turn the entire situation into a weapon. I walked around the desk and looked down at Vincent. I told him to open a new text document. I told him we were going to draft a demand letter right now and serve it to the predatory lending company before the sun went down. I paced the floor and dictated the strategy. The lender had approved a $150,000 loan without ever physically meeting the property owner. They accepted a digitally pasted signature without verifying my identity. The notary stamp on the document belonged to a man who, according to a quick search by Vincent, had his license suspended a year ago for ethical violations. The lending company had broken half a dozen federal banking regulations just to secure the loan on a valuable piece of collateral. I told Vincent to write the most aggressive, intimidating legal threat of his career. I wanted him to inform the lender that I had discovered the fraudulent mortgage. But instead of just claiming forgery, we were going to accuse the lending company of active collusion in a federal wire fraud conspiracy. We were going to threaten to bring the full weight of my corporate legal team down on their heads. We would report them to the State Attorney General, the Banking Commission, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for predatory lending practices targeting seniors. I told Vincent to make the terms incredibly simple. They had 24 hours to completely dissolve the loan release, the lien on my cabin, and scrub the debt from my property title. If they did that, I would grant them the privilege of dealing with my son on their own to recover their stolen money. If they refused, I would bury their entire company in federal subpoenas by Monday morning. Vincent typed furiously. A rare, tight smile appeared on his face. He understood exactly what I was doing. I was not just clearing my property. I was unleashing a pack of rabid, aggressive debt collectors onto my son. Cameron thought he had secured a massive pile of free cash to fund his fake lifestyle and his expensive wedding. He thought the debt was safely attached to my house. But by Monday, the entire $150,000 obligation would be severed from my cabin and dropped directly onto his completely empty bank accounts. Vincent finished drafting the letter. He hit print. The pages slid out of the machine crisp and warm. He packed his briefcase and stood up. He told me he was going to drive to the lender's office right now and hand-deliver the document to their managing director. I walked him to the front door. I watched him get into his black sedan and drive away. The board was set. Cameron had used a forgery to steal my sanctuary. I was about to use the law to turn his stolen money into a prison. I locked the door and walked back to the kitchen. My tablet pinged with a new notification from the security cameras. The real consequences were moving faster than I anticipated. I looked at the screen and watched the next phase of the disaster unfold. It was early afternoon when the notification arrived. I was still sitting in my home office reviewing the legal documents Vincent had left behind. My tablet screen lit up with an alert from the motion sensors installed at the lakeside cabin. I picked up the device and tapped the notification opening the live video feed. I expected to see a stray deer wandering onto the porch, or perhaps a neighbor turning their boat around near my dock. Instead, I saw a line of vehicles snaking down my private gravel driveway. Leading the pack was Cameron driving his leased luxury sedan. Following close behind were dozens of cars kicking up dust as they trespassed onto my land. They had nowhere else to go. With the hotel venue locked out and their bank accounts completely empty, they had made a desperate and incredibly foolish decision. Cameron had driven his bride and all their guests 2 hours north to squat on my property. He assumed the forged loan gave him some sort of imaginary right to the land. More importantly, he was banking on a fundamental misunderstanding of my character. Cameron genuinely believed that if he set up the wedding in front of 100 guests, I would simply roll over. He thought I would be too embarrassed to make a scene in front of his friends and the extended family of his bride. He thought the social pressure would force me into quiet compliance. I watched the screen as the uninvited guests began to park on my pristine grass. The original caterers with the Wagyu beef and white orchids were long gone. In their place, I watched a cheap local delivery truck pull up unloading folding chairs and aluminum trays of generic sandwiches. Cameron was running around in his expensive tuxedo, directing people toward the lawn that sloped down to the water. He was pointing and smiling, acting as if he owned the estate. He was trying to sell the narrative to his guests that this was a deliberate rustic choice rather than a frantic backup plan born out of absolute financial ruin. I did not get up from my desk. I did not grab my car keys to drive 2 hours north just to yell at them. Driving there would mean participating in their drama. It would mean giving them an audience and an opportunity to argue with me face to face. I prefer a much more surgical approach. I closed the camera application and opened the smart home hub connected to the cabin. I had spent thousands of dollars retrofitting the property with remote access technology. I controlled the locks, the thermostat, and the security system right from my phone. But more importantly, I controlled the irrigation. The cabin sits adjacent to a small apple orchard I planted a decade ago. To protect the fruit trees from unexpected frost, I had installed a commercial-grade agricultural sprinkler system. These were not the gentle oscillating sprinklers you use for a suburban lawn. These were high-capacity water cannons powered by industrial pumps that drew freezing cold water directly from the bottom of the lake. I navigated to the landscaping tab on my application. I rested my finger directly over the manual override button. I switched back to the camera feed to time my delivery perfectly. The guests were taking their seats in the white plastic folding chairs. Cameron was standing down by the water, waiting next to a man holding a small portable speaker. The music must have started because the crowd suddenly stood up and turned around. Vanessa stepped out from the side of the cabin. She was wearing her extravagant white gown, holding a bouquet of flowers she had probably bought at a supermarket on the way out of town. She had a smug, victorious smile on her face. She truly believed she had outsmarted me. She thought she had salvaged her perfect day. I waited until she was exactly halfway down the makeshift aisle. I waited until she was entirely surrounded by her seated guests with nowhere to run and no shelter nearby. Then I switched back to the control panel and pressed the override button. Through the audio feed on the cameras, I heard the deep mechanical groan of the massive water pumps kicking into gear. A split second later, a dozen industrial sprinkler heads erupted simultaneously across the lawn. Thousands of gallons of freezing lake water blasted into the air at high pressure. The water cannons swept across the grass in wide, heavy arcs. The camera feed captured absolute pandemonium. The blast of freezing water hit Vanessa directly in the chest, knocking her backward onto the wet grass. Her pristine white gown instantly turned into a heavy, soaked mess of mud and silk. The guests screamed, scrambling over the folding chairs, trying to escape the relentless downpour. Women in expensive dresses and men in tailored suits were completely drenched in seconds. The portable speaker short-circuited and died in a puff of smoke. Cameron ran toward Vanessa, slipping and falling face first into the rapidly forming mud puddles. The beautiful lakeside lawn was instantly transformed into a chaotic swamp. I watched them thrashing in the water for 30 seconds before I initiated the next phase. They were wet, but I needed them gone. I opened the security tab on my application and activated the exterior perimeter alarms. A deafening 120 decibel siren began to blare from the loudspeakers mounted under the cabin eaves. It was the kind of high-pitched, piercing alarm designed to scare off bears and burglars. It was completely unbearable to human ears. On the screen, I saw the soaked guests dropping their belongings and covering their ears in physical pain. They stopped trying to help each other and simply sprinted for their cars. The panic was absolute. The elegant wedding had devolved into a frantic stampede of terrified, freezing people covered in mud. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the non-emergency dispatch number for the county sheriff, located just 10 miles from the cabin. I spoke to the dispatcher in a calm, collected voice. I identified myself as the legal property owner of the lakeside estate. I told her I was monitoring my security cameras remotely and that a massive group of trespassers had just broken through my access gate. I informed her that they were currently vandalizing my lawn and ignoring the blaring security sirens. I requested that deputies be sent immediately to clear the property and issue criminal trespass warnings to every single person still parked on my land. I hung up the phone and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. I brought the mug back to my desk and watched the live feed. It took exactly 14 minutes for the county sheriff to arrive. 2 squad cars came sliding down the gravel driveway, their red and blue lights flashing brightly against the overcast sky. 4 deputies stepped out of the vehicles demanding order. The sirens from the cabin were still blaring, making it impossible for Cameron to argue or explain himself. I watched the deputies physically wave the guests toward the exit. People were crying, shivering, and covered in dirt as they piled into their cars and fled the scene. Cameron was trying to yell at a deputy, waving his arms and pointing at the cabin. The deputy simply put his hand on his duty belt and pointed firmly toward the exit. Even without audio, I knew exactly what was being said. Leave right now or go to jail. Vanessa was sitting in the passenger seat of their leased car, sobbing uncontrollably into her ruined dress. Her makeup was completely washed away, her hair plastered to her face. Cameron finally gave up arguing with the police. He slumped his shoulders, walked back to the car, and got in. I watched the taillights of his vehicle disappear up the driveway, followed closely by the sheriff cruisers ensuring they left the county limits. The lawn was completely empty, destroyed and covered in broken plastic chairs. The wedding was officially over. I tapped the screen once more, shutting off the water pumps and silencing the alarm. The silence returned to my home, and I closed my tablet, feeling nothing but peace. The next morning began not with a knock at the door, but with a flood of digital notifications. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, vibrating continuously against the dark granite. I ignored it while I brewed my morning coffee, but the buzzing simply would not stop. Finally, I picked up the device and saw dozens of messages from former colleagues, neighbors, and people I had not spoken to in years. They were all sending me the exact same link. It was a video posted on a highly popular social media platform. I clicked the link. The screen filled with Vanessa's face. She was sitting in the passenger seat of Cameron's car. Her hair was perfectly messy, and her makeup was carefully smudged to look like she had been crying all night. She looked directly into the camera lens and delivered the performance of a lifetime. She did not mention the canceled catering or the declined credit cards. She certainly did not mention the fact that they were illegally trespassing on my private property. Instead, she painted a horrifying picture of a wealthy, controlling narcissist who simply could not stand to see his son happy. She told her thousands of followers that I had lured them to the lakeside cabin under the guise of hosting their beautiful wedding, only to violently attack them and their innocent guests with high-pressure freezing water, simply because they refused to bend to my authoritarian rules. She cried perfectly on cue. She begged the community to share the video to expose the abusive monster hiding behind a respectable reputation. The internet loves a victim, and Vanessa played the part flawlessly. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the video had been shared thousands of times across various local community groups. My reputation was being systematically dismantled in the court of public opinion. The digital noise quickly manifested into severe real-world consequences. Shortly before noon, my phone rang with a direct call from the city municipal planning office. Even though I was officially retired, my structural engineering firm still held a highly lucrative consultation contract with the county board, advising on major infrastructure projects. I answered the phone and was greeted by the strained, tense voice of the board director. He told me that his office had been flooded with dozens of angry emails and phone calls from citizens demanding my immediate removal from the upcoming bridge renovation project. He sounded apologetic, but firm. He informed me that due to the viral nature of the allegations and the public outrage, the board was forced to suspend my consultation contract immediately pending a formal ethics review. Vanessa thought she had struck a fatal blow. She believed that by attacking my professional legacy and humiliating me publicly, I would be forced into absolute submission. She expected me to log onto the internet and start typing frantic defensive paragraphs. She wanted me to engage in a public screaming match to validate her victimhood. She wanted me to beg her to take the video down in exchange for money. I did not open a single social media application. I did not write a single word in my own defense. Public relations battles are for people who care about the opinions of strangers. I only care about leverage and facts. I walked into my home office and picked up the phone. I called a man named Gregory. Gregory was a former Treasury agent who now operated an elite private investigation firm in the city. He specialized in forensic accounting and deep background checks for high-net-worth individuals. I had used his services a few times over the years to thoroughly vet potential business partners. I hired him on the spot with a very specific and urgent objective. I told Gregory about the forged power of attorney and the $150,000 loan. I told him that Cameron simply did not have the intelligence or the nerve to execute a complex real estate fraud scheme entirely on his own. He was desperate for cash, but that specific dollar amount felt entirely too precise. I told Gregory to ignore my son completely and focus every single investigative resource on Vanessa. I wanted to know exactly why a junior corporate accountant was desperate enough to manipulate her fiancé into committing a federal crime against his own father. I authorized Gregory to use whatever databases he needed, and I gave him a blank check for his time. I spent the next few hours sitting quietly on my back porch, watching the birds at the feeder. I did not check the internet to see how many more people hated me. I let Vanessa revel in her temporary viral fame. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gregory called me back. He had found the bleeding wound. Gregory explained that Vanessa had meticulously crafted a flawless image of a successful young professional. She worked for a highly prestigious accounting firm downtown and always wore expensive designer clothes. But beneath the surface, her financial life was a complete and utter disaster. She had a severe gambling addiction. It did not start in flashy casinos where there are security cameras and heavy paper trails. It started with offshore sports betting applications and quickly escalated to unlicensed underground card games operating across the state line. Gregory had accessed her hidden financial footprints. Over the past 2 years, Vanessa had completely drained her own savings accounts. When the legitimate banks finally cut her off, she turned to far less forgiving lenders. She was currently drowning in debt owed to an illicit syndicate that did not care about her credit score or her tears. The principal amount she owed combined with the exorbitant street interest came to exactly $150,000. The puzzle pieces snapped together perfectly. Vanessa was not just trying to fund a lavish wedding reception. She was trying to save her own life from very dangerous people. She had weaponized Cameron's desperation for her approval, convincing him to steal from his own father to pay off her aggressive creditors. I thanked Gregory and ended the call. The weapon Vanessa had used against me was public opinion. It was loud, messy, and entirely based on emotional lies. The weapon I was about to use against her was corporate compliance, and it was based entirely on undeniable documented facts. I called Vincent, my attorney, and gave him the detailed dossier Gregory had just compiled. I told Vincent to bypass the police and bypass the internet entirely. We were going straight for the throat of her career. Vanessa worked at a firm that managed the private wealth of prominent local politicians and powerful corporate executives. Their entire business model was built on absolute financial trust and unquestionable employee ethics. Every single employee was contractually bound by a strict moral turpitude clause. I instructed Vincent to draft a formal legal package containing the undeniable proof of Vanessa's illegal gambling activities, her association with an organized crime syndicate, and her crippling hidden debt. I had him include a copy of the forged loan documents showing exactly how she was attempting to secure funds through identity theft and wire fraud. Vincent did not send this package to an anonymous human resources email address where it might be ignored. He used his professional connections to bypass the lower levels and sent it directly to the senior compliance officer at Vanessa's firm. He flagged the delivery as an urgent security liability concerning an active employee handling highly sensitive client financials. I stayed off the internet and waited. I knew exactly how a corporate bureaucracy responds to a massive financial liability. They do not hold hearings. They do not care about viral videos or wedding drama or personal excuses. They amputate the infected limb immediately to protect the company. At 4:15 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with an automated alert I had set up through a corporate networking site. Vanessa's professional profile had just been updated. Her employment status at the prestigious accounting firm had been changed from active to terminated. She had spent her entire morning trying to destroy my reputation with a fake story broadcast to thousands of strangers. I spent my afternoon completely destroying her actual livelihood with the absolute truth delivered to a single person. Her entire fake world was rapidly collapsing around her, and she no longer had a massive corporate paycheck to hide behind. The syndicate would be looking for their money, and she had absolutely no way to pay them. I poured myself another cup of coffee and prepared for the inevitable fallout. I was sweeping the kitchen floor when the sound of shattering glass ripped through the house. The heavy rock tore through my front living room window, sending jagged shards of glass exploding across the hardwood floor and burying themselves deep into the Persian rug. I did not flinch. I carefully leaned the broom against the counter and walked into the living room to inspect the damage. Through the broken window frame, I saw Cameron's luxury sedan parked diagonally across my front lawn, tearing deep tire tracks into the pristine grass. The driver's side door was thrown wide open. Cameron was standing on my front walkway, his face completely red with rage, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding I come outside and face him. I walked over to the hall closet and opened the solid oak door. I reached past the heavy winter coats and pulled out a solid ash wood baseball bat I had kept since my amateur league days. I did not take it out with the intention of swinging it at my son. I took it out because I am a 62-year-old man and my son is 30 years younger and currently operating under a state of temporary insanity. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. I placed the barrel of the bat on the wooden floorboards and rested both of my hands over the knob, leaning my entire weight onto it like a cane. I looked down at him and waited for him to speak. Cameron launched into a completely unhinged tirade. He screamed that I was a monster and a vindictive old man. He said I had completely ruined Vanessa's life and maliciously destroyed her career. He told me she had been escorted out of her prestigious accounting firm by building security with all of her personal belongings shoved into a single cardboard box, while her former colleagues stood around and watched in absolute silence. He blamed me for the fact that she was now entirely unemployable in the financial sector. He did not take a single ounce of responsibility for her illegal gambling syndicate or the forged loan documents they created together. He simply stood on my lawn, demanding that I call her firm immediately and retract the evidence. He demanded I fix the massive disaster I had created for them. I let him scream until his voice grew hoarse and cracked. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke. My voice was low, calm, and devoid of any parental warmth. I did not address Vanessa or her ruined career. I addressed the rock currently sitting on my living room rug. I asked him if he realized what he had just done by vandalizing my personal property in a fit of temper. Cameron scoffed loudly, throwing his arms in the air. He said he did not care about a stupid window and told me to call my lawyers and sue him for the replacement cost. He thought he was being untouchable. I told him he was missing the bigger picture. I explained that I was not going to sue him for a piece of glass. I was going to use that rock to take away his home. 4 years ago, Cameron begged me for help buying a place downtown. He wanted to live in the most expensive financial district, but he did not have the credit score or the massive down payment required for a luxury condominium. I purchased the top floor unit for him in pure cash. But I never put his name on the deed. I placed the property inside a silent trust managed by a corporate shell company that I entirely controlled. I let him live there completely rent-free. I let him boast to his friends that he was a successful homeowner who conquered the real estate market. I let him invite women over and pretend he was a self-made millionaire. He truly believed the condo belonged to him simply because he possessed the metal keys and paid the monthly electric bill. I looked down at him from the porch and explained the specific legal structure of the trust for the very first time. I told him that his residency was contingent on a highly specific good conduct clause hidden deep within the original trust charter. The clause explicitly stipulated that any act of violence, vandalism, or hostility directed toward the primary trustee, which was me, would result in the immediate and permanent forfeiture of his residency rights. By throwing that rock through my window, he had legally triggered his own eviction. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. Vincent had anticipated this kind of reckless retaliation when we destroyed Vanessa's career, and we had prepared accordingly. I walked down the 3 porch steps. I did not raise the bat. I simply extended the paper toward him. Cameron snatched it from my hand, his eyes darting across the text. I told him to read the top line aloud, It was an emergency 3-day notice to quit the premises. But it was not just a standard warning letter. It had been officially signed and stamped by a county judge just 2 hours ago, based on the massive financial fraud case we were already building behind the scenes. I informed him that the clock started ticking the exact second the rock hit my floor. Furthermore, I told him that as the legal owner of the property, I had already contacted the municipal utility companies. The electricity, the running water, and the high-speed internet to that specific unit would be completely shut off at exactly midnight tonight. Cameron looked at the court order, and then he started to laugh. It was a desperate, manic sound echoing across the quiet suburban street. He crumbled the judge-signed order in his fist and threw it onto the wet grass. He told me I was completely out of my mind. He said he had lived in that unit for 4 consecutive years and that he had legally established permanent residency. He smugly crossed his arms, leaned against his car, and told me all about squatters' rights. He said even with a judge's signature, the actual physical eviction process involving the sheriff's department would take months to execute. He told me he and Vanessa were going to drive back to his condo, lock the heavy door, and live there in the dark if they had to. He promised to completely trash the beautiful unit, tear the expensive copper wiring out of the walls, and smash the stainless steel appliances before the authorities ever got a chance to drag him out. He thought he had found a brilliant legal loophole to punish me. I smiled. It was the very first time I had smiled in 2 days. I told him that squatters' rights only apply if you can actually get inside the physical property to squat. I reminded him that I was a retired structural engineer who deeply appreciated modern convenience and absolute security. When I bought the luxury condo, I had the private contractors install high-end electronic smart locks on the front door and the balcony access points. They were the kind of advanced locks that connected directly to a central home security application on my personal cell phone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the security application. I held the phone up high so Cameron could clearly see the glowing interface. I navigated to the property management tab for the downtown condo. I told Cameron that I knew he had rushed over here in a blind rage the second Vanessa got fired. I knew neither of them were currently inside the apartment. They were both out in the world completely exposed. I tapped the screen with my thumb. A loud electronic chirp came from my phone confirming the command had been sent through the network. I looked Cameron dead in the eye and told him I had just changed the master passcode and initiated a hard remote lockdown. The electronic deadbolts were now permanently sealed shut. His plastic key fob was entirely disabled. His mobile access privileges were completely revoked. He was effectively locked out of his own life the second he left the unit this afternoon. All of his custom designer clothes, his expensive electronics, and his vintage watches were sitting safe and secure behind a solid core steel door that he could no longer open under any circumstances. Cameron stopped laughing instantly. He frantically dug into his pockets and pulled out his own phone, tapping wildly on his security app. I watched his face drop as the screen displayed a bright red "Access Denied" error message. He looked up at me completely horrified, his mouth hanging open. He realized he was standing on my lawn with nothing but the clothes on his back and a leased car he could no longer afford. I turned around, walked back up the porch steps, and went inside my house. I did not say another word to him. I stepped carefully over the broken glass, shut the front door, and engaged my own deadbolt, leaving him standing alone in the fading daylight, realizing he was entirely homeless. The house was peaceful for exactly 48 hours after I locked Cameron out of his condominium. I spent the time organizing my garage and tending to the garden, enjoying the profound silence of a life completely devoid of ungrateful dependence. I knew Cameron and Vanessa had retreated to a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. I knew this because I still had access to the tracking application for his leased vehicle. I watched the digital pin move from my neighborhood to a rundown establishment near the interstate and stay there. I did not care what they were doing. I assumed they were simply sitting in a dark room blaming me for their catastrophic failures. But the consequences of Vanessa's hidden life were moving much faster than a simple family dispute. At 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through my quiet hallway. I was not expecting any packages, and I certainly was not expecting any guests. I walked to the front door and looked through the reinforced glass side panel. 2 men were standing on my porch. They did not look like salesmen, and they did not look like police officers. They were wearing meticulously tailored charcoal suits that probably cost $2,000 each. But the expensive wool could not hide the thick, muscular build of their shoulders or the brutal history etched into their faces. The taller man had a nose that had clearly been broken multiple times and healed slightly off-center. The shorter man had thick, scarred tissue around his ears, a classic cauliflower deformity common in underground fighters. I knew instantly these men were not from a legitimate collection agency. They were the shadow creditors. They were the enforcers for the unlicensed gambling syndicate Vanessa owed $150,000. Most men my age would have panicked. They would have locked the door, hit the panic button on their security system, and hidden in the bathroom until the police arrived. I did not do any of those things. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. The taller man looked at me with cold, dead eyes. He asked if I was Russell Cole. He did not introduce himself. He did not hand me a business card. He simply stated that my daughter-in-law had a massive outstanding financial obligation to his employers. He said that since my name was attached to the recent real estate loan, they assumed I was the silent guarantor covering her debts. They assumed I was the wealthy father who would quietly write a 6-figure check to keep his family safe from physical harm. They thought they could intimidate a lonely retired engineer into emptying his retirement accounts. I looked at the taller man, and then I looked at the shorter man. I told them they had driven a long way for nothing, but since they were already here, they might as well come inside. The 2 enforcers exchanged a brief, confused glance. This was clearly not the reaction they were used to. They were used to tears, begging, and frantic negotiations. They stepped into my foyer looking around at the expensive artwork and the hardwood floors. I led them past the living room and into the open kitchen. I gestured for them to sit at the granite island. I turned my back to them, walking over to the coffee maker. I poured 3 mugs of dark roast coffee and carried them back to the island, sliding 2 of the ceramic cups toward my dangerous guests. They did not touch the coffee. They sat rigidly on the bar stools, waiting for me to speak. I walked into my home office and retrieved the thick manila folder Vincent and Gregory had prepared for me. I brought it back to the kitchen and dropped it onto the granite countertop directly between the 2 men. I flipped the folder open. I told them I knew exactly who they were and exactly how much Vanessa owed them. I also told them they were operating under a massive piece of misinformation. I pulled out the forensic accounting records and spread them across the island. I showed them the zeroed-out bank accounts. I showed them the documentation proving the credit cards were permanently canceled. I pulled out a copy of the forged power of attorney and the legal demand letter Vincent had sent to the predatory lending company. I explained in a calm, steady voice that I was not a guarantor for Vanessa's gambling addiction. I told them my son had committed felony wire fraud to secure that loan and that the debt was currently being legally severed from my property. I made it absolutely clear that my money was locked behind impenetrable corporate firewalls and ironclad trusts. I told them they could break my legs or burn my house to the ground, and they still would not get a single dime from my accounts, because I had legally and financially amputated my son from my life. The taller man leaned forward, inspecting the legal documents. He was a criminal, but he was not stupid. He recognized binding corporate legal paperwork when he saw it. He realized I was telling the truth. I was a dead end. The realization made his jaw tighten. He looked up at me and asked where the couple was hiding. He said if I was not going to pay the debt, then Cameron and Vanessa were going to have a very painful afternoon. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a sudden surge of paternal instinct to protect my son from the monsters he had invited into our lives. Cameron had made his choices. He had stolen my signature and tried to steal my sanctuary. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of white paper. I slid the paper across the smooth granite. The shorter man picked it up. I told them Cameron and Vanessa were currently hiding in room 112 at the Starlight Motel on Highway 47. I gave them the exact make, model, and license plate number of the luxury sedan parked right outside their door. I told the men that Cameron was a complete fraud with no liquid cash, but he was incredibly vain. I explained that Cameron traveled everywhere with a reinforced leather case containing 4 vintage Rolex watches. I had purchased those watches for him over the years to celebrate his college graduation and various fake business milestones. I told the enforcers that the current secondary market value of those timepieces was easily $40,000. It would not clear the entire principal of the debt, but it would certainly cover their exorbitant interest fees for the month. The taller man folded the piece of paper and slid it into the breast pocket of his expensive suit. He looked at me for a long moment. There was no longer any intimidation in his gaze. There was a strange kind of professional respect. He realized I was infinitely colder than they were. They broke bones for money. I was casually feeding my own blood to the wolves over a matter of principle. The 2 men stood up from the bar stools. They did not touch the coffee. The taller man nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the transaction we had just completed. I walked them back to the front door and opened it. They stepped out into the afternoon sun, walking down my driveway and getting into a black-tinted sport utility vehicle parked on the street. I watched them drive away, heading straight for the highway. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The shadow creditors were no longer my problem. They were a heat-seeking missile locked directly onto room 112. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up my coffee mug, and took a slow, satisfying sip. The financial starvation had worked perfectly. Now the physical reality of their actions was about to knock very loudly on their motel room door. Cameron woke up the next morning in that cheap motel and put on his only remaining tailored suit. He drove to the financial district believing he still possessed one final fortress. He was the vice president of marketing at a highly successful technology startup. He truly believed he had earned that executive position through his own sheer brilliance and raw talent. He thought his corporate title made him untouchable and insulated him from the disaster unfolding in his personal life. He did not know the actual history of the company he worked for. 5 years ago, when the founder was operating out of a tiny rented garage, I was the silent angel investor who provided the massive seed funding required to launch their very first product. I owned a significant percentage of the corporate equity. When the young founder asked me how he could repay my generosity, I simply asked him to give my son a job and make him feel important. Cameron was a diversity hire for nepotism. He was entirely shielded from the actual heavy lifting of the company, functioning merely as a well-dressed figurehead. The shadow creditors I had redirected yesterday were not foolish enough to waste their morning banging on a hollow motel room door. They were apex predators, and they understood exactly how to hunt corporate prey. They knew that a man hiding in a cheap motel is a man who has nothing left to lose and is ready to run. But a man who shows up to his high-paying job is a man who desperately wants to maintain his illusion of status. The 2 enforcers in their expensive charcoal suits bypassed the highway motel entirely. They drove straight downtown and waited in the pristine marble lobby of the startup office building. At exactly 8:45 in the morning, Cameron walked through the revolving glass doors holding a cup of expensive artisanal coffee, acting like he owned the entire city block. I did not have to guess what happened next because I watched it unfold in high definition. I was sitting at my kitchen island when my email chimed with a priority encrypted message from the chief executive officer of the startup. The subject line simply said, "Urgent security incident." Attached was a large video file pulled directly from the lobby surveillance cameras. I opened the file and pressed play on my tablet. The footage showed Cameron strutting toward the secure elevator banks. The 2 enforcers seamlessly intercepted his path. They did not shout or cause a massive physical altercation that would immediately draw the building guards. They operated with a terrifying quiet efficiency. The taller man with the broken nose simply placed his heavy hand on Cameron's shoulder and leaned in very close to his ear. I watched the arrogant swagger completely evaporate from my son's body in a fraction of a second. He dropped his coffee cup, spilling hot liquid all over the polished marble floor. The security footage had no audio, but the body language conveyed the entire story perfectly. The enforcers were calmly explaining the physical reality of his $150,000 syndicate debt. Cameron tried to back away, but the shorter man with the cauliflower ears stepped smoothly behind him, blocking his escape route. Right there in the middle of the morning rush hour, surrounded by dozens of his wealthy tech colleagues and junior employees, Cameron completely broke down. He did not stand tall and face his creditors like a man. He physically collapsed under the weight of his own fear. My son dropped right down onto his knees in the middle of the corporate lobby. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, begging and pleading with two enforcers connected to an illegal gambling syndicate. He exposed his direct ties to violent organized crime in front of the entire corporate world. The chief executive officer called my personal cell phone exactly 3 minutes after I finished watching the video. He was furious and terrified. He explained that a modern technology firm handling sensitive financial data simply cannot employ an executive whose personal life is entangled with violent loan sharks. The presence of syndicate enforcers in their lobby was a massive security liability for every other innocent employee in the building. It was also a massive public relations disaster waiting to happen if their corporate clients found out. He told me the board of directors had just concluded a frantic 10-minute emergency meeting. They were voting to terminate Cameron immediately for gross misconduct and for creating a hostile work environment. The executive nervously asked me if I would object to the immediate firing since Cameron was my biological son. I told him I did not object at all. I gave him my full blessing as a major shareholder. I instructed him to have building security pack up Cameron's desk into a cardboard box and physically escort him out the back service exit into the alleyway. The financial demolition was now absolute. The bank accounts were drained. The credit cards were permanently dead. The luxury condo was electronically sealed, and now the six-figure salary was entirely gone. At exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, my cell phone rang again. I looked at the glowing screen and saw Cameron's name. I answered the call and put the phone to my ear. I did not say hello, I just listened to the silence. The voice on the other end of the line did not belong to the arrogant, entitled man who had thrown a heavy rock through my living room window just yesterday. It was the sound of a completely broken human being. Cameron was sobbing so hard he could barely form a coherent sentence. I could hear the sound of traffic in the background. He was sitting in his leased car, hyperventilating and crying. He begged me to save him. He told me he had just been fired and marched out of his beautiful office building like a common street criminal. He told me the men in the dark suits had given him exactly 48 hours to produce the first $50,000 in cash, or they were going to put him in the intensive care unit. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by raw, primal fear. He started bargaining frantically, throwing everything and everyone away to save himself. He promised he would leave Vanessa today. He called his new bride a parasite and a liar, blaming her for the entire situation. He promised he would drive to the courthouse and sign the divorce papers by tomorrow morning if I would just wire the money to the syndicate to make the men go away. He offered to sacrifice the woman he supposedly loved without a single second of hesitation just to save his own skin. He swore he would do anything I asked if I would just bail him out one last time. I listened to him cry and beg for 2 full minutes. I let him hear the cold, heavy silence on my end of the line. I wanted him to fully understand that his tears no longer held any emotional currency with me. I did not offer him comfort. I did not tell him everything was going to be all right. I spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. I told him that I was not going to wire a single dollar to his bank account. I told him that his empty promises meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. But I told him I was willing to offer him one final legal arrangement. I instructed him to drive to the downtown financial district tomorrow morning. I told him to walk up to the 14th floor of the Vanguard legal building and meet me in Vincent Gallagher's private conference room at exactly 8 o'clock. I told him to come entirely alone and to be exactly on time, or I would wash my hands of him permanently. I hung up the phone before he could reply, leaving him alone in his car to face the darkest and most terrifying night of his entire life. I arrived at the Vanguard Legal Building at 7:30 in the morning. Vincent was already sitting at the head of his massive mahogany conference table, arranging the physical documents into two neat, separate piles. We did not speak. We just waited for the clock to strike 8. At exactly 2 minutes past the hour, the heavy glass door of the conference room clicked open. Cameron walked in. He looked completely destroyed. He was wearing the exact same clothes he had on yesterday when he was fired. His dress shirt was wrinkled and stained with coffee. He had not shaved. His eyes were bloodshot and darting frantically around the room, as if he expected the men in the dark suits to step out from behind the bookshelves. He practically sprinted to the chair opposite me and collapsed into it, breathing heavily. He started talking immediately. He babbled about how he had not slept a single minute. He said he kept looking out the window of his motel room, convinced every passing car was the syndicate coming to collect their money. He looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes and asked if I brought the check. I did not offer him a polite greeting. I did not ask him how he was holding up. I reached across the wide table and slid the first stack of papers directly in front of him. I told him I was prepared to wire $150,000 to the syndicate account this very morning. I would clear the principal and I would pay the aggressive interest penalties. I would make the shadow creditors disappear from his life permanently. Cameron let out a massive breath of relief and reached for a pen. But before his fingers could touch the plastic, I placed my hand firmly over the documents. I told him the money was not a gift, and it certainly was not a fatherly loan. It was a corporate buyout. I explained the terms of the contract under my hand. In exchange for clearing his syndicate debt, Cameron was going to formally sign over his entire 15% equity stake in the tech startup back to my holding company. Cameron pulled his hand back as if the paper had burned him. His bloodshot eyes widened in absolute shock. He shook his head violently. He tried to summon the last pathetic scrap of his corporate arrogance. He told me that was extortion. He reminded me that the startup was slated for a massive initial public offering next spring. He said his 15% stake would easily be worth over $4 million once the company went public. He called my offer insane and said he would never sign away his entire financial future just to cover a fraction of that amount today. He actually tried to negotiate with me, proposing a payment plan or offering to sign over a single %. I let him ramble for 30 seconds. Then I slowly lifted my left arm and checked my watch. I looked back at my son and interrupted his frantic negotiating. I told him he was deeply confused about his current market value. I told him he did not have weeks or months to wait for a stock payout. He had a biological ticking clock. I informed him that I had not just spoken to the syndicate enforcers yesterday. I had actually provided them with his exact daily schedule. I pointed to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the downtown financial district. I told Cameron to stand up, walk over to the glass, and look straight down into the visitor parking lot across the street. He hesitated, but the cold certainty in my voice forced him out of his chair. He walked to the window and looked down. I did not even need to stand up to know what he was looking at. Sitting in the designated loading zone directly in front of the building entrance was a large black tinted sport utility vehicle. It had been idling there for 15 minutes. I told Cameron that the two men inside that vehicle were not there to attend a meeting. They were waiting for him to walk out of this lobby. I explained that I had orchestrated their arrival. I had sent a message through Gregory's underground contacts, letting the syndicate know that Cameron would be at this exact address at 8 o'clock, trying to secure their funds. I gave them permission to wait. I looked at my watch one more time. I told my son he had exactly 60 seconds to make a permanent business decision. He could sign the equity transfer right now and walk out the back service exit as a free man with zero debt. Or he could refuse to sign, walk out the front lobby doors, and try to explain to the two gentlemen with the cauliflower ears that his stock options would be very valuable next year. Cameron backed away from the window. He looked physically sick. The realization that I was actually willing to feed him to the wolves completely shattered the last remaining pieces of his entitlement. He stumbled back to the leather chair and fell into it. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely pick up the heavy metal pen Vincent had provided. He did not read the contract. He flipped straight to the signature page. He scrawled his name on the dotted line, pressing so hard the ink almost tore through the thick paper. He pushed the document back across the table, panting like a cornered animal. He looked at me and whispered that it was done. He said I had taken everything from him, and he asked if he could finally leave. He thought he had survived the trap. He thought the transaction was complete. I slid the signed equity transfer over to Vincent, who calmly stamped it with his notary seal. Then I looked back at Cameron. I told him he was free from the syndicate, but our personal business was not quite finished. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a second single sheet of paper. It was not a thick corporate contract. It was incredibly brief. I slid it across the mahogany table, stopping it right in front of his shaking hands. I told him to read it carefully. Cameron looked down. It was a sworn legal affidavit drafted by Vincent. It was a complete and binding confession to felony wire fraud and identity theft. The document explicitly stated that Cameron Cole, acting alone and with full malicious intent, had forged the signature of Russell Cole on a power of attorney document to fraudulently secure a $150,000 mortgage against the lakeside cabin. Cameron stared at the words. His breathing stopped. He looked up at me, completely paralyzed. He realized the terrifying magnitude of what was happening. I had not just taken his future millions to cover his syndicate debt. I was demanding he hand me the loaded gun that could send him to federal prison for a decade. He asked me why I was doing this. He said he had already given me all his shares and that he had absolutely nothing left to give. I told him this document was not about money. This document was about absolute permanent control. The equity transfer was the price he paid to the syndicate to keep his legs from being broken. This confession was the price he was going to pay me for the disrespect he had shown my home, my property, and the memory of his dead mother, whose medical paperwork he had violated. I told him I needed an insurance policy to guarantee he would never attempt to retaliate or challenge my authority again. I pointed the tip of my pen at the blank signature line at the bottom of the confession and told him to pick up his pen and sign it immediately. Cameron looked at the confession paper sitting on the mahogany table. He read the words detailing his felony wire fraud and the theft of my signature. He did not sign it. He dropped the heavy metal pen on the table and pushed his chair back. He stood up, trembling with a mixture of fear and leftover pride. He told me I was out of my mind if I thought he would willingly hand me the keys to his own prison cell. He said he would rather take his chances with the authorities than give me absolute control over his entire future. He turned around and stormed out of the conference room, leaving the unsigned document behind. Vincent asked if we should force the issue. I told him no. I told Vincent to let him go because I knew exactly how this ecosystem worked. Cameron was terrified, but he still possessed a fragile ego. Vanessa, on the other hand, operated entirely on self-preservation. I knew the trap was already perfectly set for the weakest link in their crumbling marriage. I returned to my quiet house and waited as the afternoon turned into evening. The sky grew dark and a light rain began to fall against my windows. At exactly 9 o'clock, my cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unknown number. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear. I heard a nervous, shaky breath on the other end of the line. It was Vanessa. Her voice was barely a whisper. She told me she was calling from a prepaid disposable phone she had bought at a convenience store because she knew Cameron was becoming incredibly paranoid. She said Cameron was pacing around their cheap motel room, completely losing his grip on reality after realizing he gave up his stock options for nothing. She told me she could no longer tie her sinking ship to his anchor. She wanted to make a deal. Vanessa offered to turn state evidence against my son. She promised to go to the district attorney and swear under oath that the forged loan on my lakeside cabin was entirely the idea of Cameron. She offered to be my star witness and guarantee his conviction. But loyalty like hers always comes with a price tag. She demanded a $50,000 relocation fee in pure cash. She said she needed the money to leave the state quietly and start a new life far away from the syndicate and far away from my family. I did not act surprised or disgusted by her massive betrayal. I simply agreed to her terms. I told her to meet me at a 24-hour diner located on the industrial edge of the city right off the highway at midnight. Before I left my house, I made a brief phone call to Gregory, my private investigator. I met him in a dimly lit grocery store parking lot, where he handed me a specialized piece of audio equipment. It was a high-grade digital recording device thin enough to be completely invisible under clothing. I drove to the diner, parked my truck in the empty lot, and carefully taped the microphone directly to the center of my chest, underneath my button-down shirt. I placed a thick white envelope in my jacket pocket and walked inside. The diner was almost completely deserted. The neon sign outside buzzed loudly, and the air inside smelled heavily of stale coffee and burnt frying oil. I slid into a vinyl booth in the far back corner facing the entrance. 10 minutes later, the front door jingled. Vanessa walked in. She looked absolutely nothing like the glamorous bride who had tried to trespass on my property just a few days ago. She was wearing a baggy hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled up over her head. She kept her head down and practically ran to my booth, sliding into the seat across from me. She looked over her shoulder, terrified that someone had followed her. A tired waitress walked over and poured us 2 mugs of black coffee without saying a word. Once she walked away, Vanessa immediately leaned across the sticky table. She asked if I brought the cash. I told her the money was sitting in my jacket pocket, but I needed absolute assurances before I handed over a small fortune. I played the role of the skeptical, cautious father. I told her I needed to know exactly what she was going to tell the authorities. I needed to know the specific details of the crime to ensure her testimony was bulletproof enough to put Cameron away. She took the bait immediately. The prospect of $50,000 in cash made her completely reckless. She began to speak in a rapid, hushed tone. She started explaining the entire timeline of the forgery. But I did not just let her blame Cameron. I guided the conversation carefully, playing to her massive ego. I asked her how someone as incompetent as my son could possibly execute such a complex real estate fraud without making a fatal mistake. Vanessa smiled a cold, vicious smile. She leaned even closer and admitted that Cameron did not execute it alone. She explicitly detailed how she manipulated him into stealing my identity. She told me how she found the medical documents belonging to my late wife in his old files. She explained how she practically held his hand while he digitally copied the trembling signature. She openly confessed that the entire scheme was designed solely to cover her illegal gambling debts. She drank her coffee and actually started laughing. She laughed at the gullibility of my son. She called him weak and pathetic. She boasted about how easy it was to convince him that borrowing against my cabin was his own brilliant idea. She detailed every lie she told him and every emotional string she pulled to use him as a human shield against her syndicate creditors. She laid out the entire criminal conspiracy in perfect chronological order, implicating herself as the mastermind while simultaneously betraying the man she had just married. She finished her story, took a deep breath, and extended her open hand across the table. She told me her testimony would give me the absolute control I wanted. She demanded the envelope. I looked at her extended hand. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the thick white envelope. I slid it across the table, stopping it right under her fingers. Vanessa grabbed the envelope greedily. She tore open the flap, expecting to find thick stacks of $100 bills. She reached inside and pulled out the contents. Her vicious smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her face. She was holding a single crisp $1 bill. She looked at the dollar, and then she looked at me. Her eyes were wide with confusion and rising panic. She asked me what kind of sick joke this was. She demanded to know where the rest of the $50,000 was hiding. Her voice grew louder, echoing in the empty diner. She threatened to walk out and leave me with nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I slowly slid out of the vinyl booth and stood up straight. I looked down at her sitting in the dim diner light, clutching her $1 bill. I told her there was no more money. I told her the dollar she was holding was the exact market value of her loyalty and the true worth of her marriage. Vanessa started to scream at me, calling me a liar. Before she could launch into another tirade, I raised my hand and pointed my index finger directly at the center of my own chest. I tapped my fingers firmly against my shirt, right where the digital microphone was secured. I tapped it 3 times, letting the dull thud echo between us. I told her I did not need her testimony in a courtroom anymore. I told her I had just recorded every single word of her arrogant confession, including her detailed admission of orchestrating the wire fraud and exploiting my dead wife to cover her illegal gambling syndicate debts. I explained that I now possessed the absolute undeniable proof that she was the primary architect of the entire felony conspiracy. Vanessa stopped breathing. She stared at my chest, realizing she had just handed me the weapon that would completely destroy her life. She was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her own stupidity. I did not wait for her to start crying or begging. I turned around and walked toward the exit of the diner. I pushed open the glass door, stepping out into the cold night air. I looked back one final time and told her I would see her in federal court. I let the door swing shut behind me, leaving her completely alone in the fluorescent light, holding the $1 bill that had just bought her a guaranteed seat in a prison cell. It was a Wednesday morning when I decided to execute the final maneuver. I sent a single text message to Cameron. I kept the message brief and perfectly calibrated to trigger his desperation. I told him the stress of the last few days was severely impacting my health. I claimed I was exhausted by the endless fighting, the legal threats, and the physical danger hovering over our family. I told him I simply wanted to wash my hands of the entire disaster. I offered a joint settlement. I told him I was willing to write a cashier check large enough to pay off the syndicate debt entirely and provide them with enough seed money to move to a different state and start over completely debt-free. The only condition was that both he and Vanessa had to be present at the Vanguard legal offices to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a permanent restraining order. Greed is a highly predictable motivator. Despite the fact that Cameron had just signed away his equity to me, and Vanessa had just tried to secretly sell him out to the authorities for $50,000, they somehow managed to pretend everything was fine. They arrived at the downtown law office at exactly 10 in the morning. Vincent was already waiting inside the large glass-enclosed conference room on the 14th floor. The heavy mahogany table was completely bare, except for a small, cylindrical object sitting perfectly in the center. Cameron and Vanessa walked in together. They were actually holding hands. It was a pathetic, nauseating display of fake unity born entirely out of a shared desire for free money. They sat down next to each other in the high-backed leather chairs. Vanessa even managed to look at me with a soft, sympathetic expression, as if I was just a tired old man finally surrendering to her superior tactics. She was wearing a new trench coat, acting as if the parking lot ambush and the diner betrayal had never happened. Cameron looked physically relieved. His posture was relaxed for the first time in days. He leaned back in his chair, assuming I had finally broken down out of paternal guilt. They were waiting for me to pull out a checkbook and save them from the nightmare they had created. I did not sit down. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city street and looked down at the tiny cars moving below. I nodded silently at Vincent. Vincent stood up, walked over to the thick glass door, and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The loud mechanical click echoed sharply in the quiet room. Cameron flinched slightly at the sound of the lock engaging, but Vanessa simply squeezed his hand reassuringly. She was incredibly confident in her own manipulation. She asked me where the settlement paperwork was. She asked how much the cashier check was made out for, and if the funds would clear the bank by the afternoon so they could pay off the shadow creditors. I turned around and looked at her. I told her there was no settlement paperwork and there was no check. I walked over to the mahogany table. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and wirelessly connected it to the small black Bluetooth speaker sitting right in front of them. Vanessa looked at the speaker, and her fake sympathetic expression faltered instantly. She recognized the setup. A cold, terrifying realization washed over her face. She started to stand up, telling Cameron this was a trick and that they needed to leave the locked room right now. I pressed the play button on my phone before she could even push her chair back. The audio quality was incredibly crisp. Gregory had provided top-tier surveillance equipment for the wire. The recording started with the ambient background noise of the midnight diner, the clinking of coffee mugs, and the faint hum of the neon sign outside. Then Vanessa's voice filled the conference room. It was not her sweet public voice. It was the cold, calculating whisper she used when she thought no one else was listening. The speaker broadcasted her exact words perfectly into the silent room. She offered to turn state evidence against my son. She demanded $50,000 in pure cash to disappear and guarantee his criminal conviction. Cameron completely froze. He dropped Vanessa's hand as if her skin was suddenly covered in acid. He stared at the black speaker, entirely paralyzed by shock. But the recording did not stop there. I let it play as Vanessa explicitly detailed how she manipulated him from the very beginning. The room listened in absolute silence as she called her own husband weak and pathetic. We heard her boast about how easy it was to convince him to forge my signature on the loan documents. We heard her admit that the entire scheme was orchestrated solely to pay off her own illegal gambling syndicate debts. She had used him as a blind human shield and laughed openly about his gullibility right to my face. I tapped my phone screen, stopping the playback. The silence that followed the recording was heavy and incredibly dangerous. Cameron slowly turned his head to look at the woman sitting next to him. His face was completely devoid of color. The illusion of his perfect marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. He realized he had destroyed his relationship with his father, lost his luxury apartment, forfeited his multi-million-dollar stock options, and committed a federal felony, all for a woman who was actively trying to sell him to the district attorney for a bag of cash. Cameron did not cry this time. The absolute humiliation ignited a blind, violent rage inside him. He lunged across the wide leather armrests, grabbing Vanessa by the shoulders of her expensive trench coat. He screamed directly into her face. He called her a parasite and a monster. He demanded to know how she could do this to him after everything he had sacrificed to protect her from the shadow creditors. He shook her violently, knocking her designer purse onto the floor. Her makeup compacts, loose change, and the single $1 bill I had given her spilled out across the expensive carpet. Vanessa did not cower. With her fake image completely destroyed and her escape plan ruined, she dropped the victim act entirely. She swung her arm back and slapped Cameron across the face with incredible force. The sound cracked like a whip in the enclosed room. She pushed him away with both hands, standing up and towering over him. She screamed that he was a pathetic, broke loser who could not even stand up to his own father. She told him she never loved him and only stayed because she thought he was going to inherit a massive real estate fortune when I died. She called him a gullible fool who deserved exactly what he was getting because he was too stupid to see he was being used from the very first day they met. They tore each other apart verbally and physically right there in the conference room. Cameron pulled his gold wedding band off his finger and threw it violently across the room, where it bounced off the glass wall with a sharp ping. Vanessa kicked his shin and spit right on his leather shoes. They were screaming so loudly and with such venom that Vincent took a step back toward the wall to avoid being caught in the crossfire. I just stood at the head of the table with my hands in my pockets and watched the destruction unfold. I did not have to raise my voice. I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy their union. I simply provided the absolute truth and let their own toxic greed do all the heavy lifting. In less than 3 minutes, the grand romantic love story they had tried to force down my throat at the country club was completely reduced to ash. They had entirely destroyed themselves. The physical altercation eventually ran its course. The screaming slowly turned into exhausted panting. Cameron was leaning heavily against the glass wall of the conference room, rubbing his red cheek where Vanessa had struck him. Vanessa was kneeling on the carpet frantically trying to gather her spilled belongings with trembling hands. She shoved the loose change and the single $1 bill back into her designer purse and slowly stood up, avoiding my gaze entirely. The air in the room was thick with the toxic residue of their destroyed marriage. They had nothing left to say to each other. The illusion of their unified front was dead and buried. I waited for complete silence before I made my next move. I did not raise my voice. I simply told them to sit back down in the leather chairs. They obeyed, immediately moving like broken machines. They did not look at each other. They sat at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, staring blankly at the polished wood. I nodded to Vincent. He stepped away from the locked door carrying a thick leather portfolio. He walked to the center of the table and began to distribute the final ultimatums. He moved with the cold precision of a surgeon laying out his tools. He placed a heavy stack of legal documents directly in front of Cameron and an identical stack in front of Vanessa. He set 2 heavy metal pens next to the papers. I stood at the head of the table and laid out their future. I told them they had exactly 2 choices regarding how this morning would end. I called the first choice the criminal option. I pointed to my cell phone sitting next to the Bluetooth speaker. I told them that if they chose the first option, they could stand up right now and walk out the door. But if they did, I would immediately forward the crystal-clear audio recording of Vanessa's extortion attempt to the county prosecutor. I would hand over the forensic accounting files proving her ties to the illegal gambling syndicate. I would deliver the forged power of attorney document, complete with Cameron's fake signature, directly to the federal authorities. I made sure they understood exactly what that meant. I explained the federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud and identity theft. I told Cameron he was looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for encumbering my property across state banking lines. I looked at Vanessa and told her that her conspiracy charges would carry an equal sentence. I painted a very vivid picture of their future behind bars. I told them their expensive clothes and their arrogant attitudes would not survive a single day in federal lockup. I promised them that if they chose to fight me, I would spend every single dollar of my retirement funds, making sure the district attorney prosecuted them to the absolute maximum extent of the law. They sat perfectly still, listening to the exact dimensions of their impending doom. Neither of them said a word. The arrogance that had fueled them for the past week was completely gone. Then I presented the second choice, the exit strategy. I told them to look at the first document sitting on the top of their stacks. It was an ironclad, comprehensive, non-disclosure agreement. I explained the terms very slowly. If they signed it, they were legally bound to complete silence regarding my life, my finances, and the events of the past week. If Vanessa ever decided to make another tearful social media video about me, or if Cameron ever tried to speak to my former colleagues, I would immediately seize whatever meager wages they managed to earn for the rest of their natural lives. The financial penalties written into the contract would bankrupt them for 10 lifetimes. I instructed them to turn to the second document. It was a lifetime restraining order. I had drawn the boundaries with absolute geographical precision. They were legally prohibited from ever coming within 500 physical yards of my person. They were banned from my primary suburban residence. They were permanently barred from the lakeside cabin. They were not even allowed to walk on the same city block as the corporate headquarters of my former engineering firm. If I was eating at a restaurant and they walked in, they were legally required to turn around and walk out immediately. If they violated the distance boundary even once, they would be arrested on the spot. Finally, I pointed to the thickest document at the bottom of the pile. I looked directly at my son. I told him this was the most important signature of his entire life. It was a legally binding assumption of debt. Vincent had spent the last 2 days aggressively negotiating with the predatory lending company. To avoid a massive federal fraud lawsuit, the lender had agreed to completely scrub the fraudulent lien from my property title. But the borrowed money still existed. I told Cameron that by signing that final document, he was legally transferring the entire $150,000 loan away from my name and assuming it entirely as his own unsecured personal debt. He would bear the full burden of the exorbitant interest rates. He would be solely responsible for the monthly payments. If he defaulted, the lenders would not come after my cabin. They would come after him, and they would garnish whatever minimum wage paycheck he managed to secure in the future. I stopped talking and let the reality of the situation settle over them. I gave them a choice between federal prison and a lifetime of silent financial servitude. Cameron stared at the assumption of debt contract. His hands began to shake again. He realized he was signing away his entire financial future to pay for the mistakes of a woman who despised him. But he also knew he had absolutely no leverage left. He looked at the locked door. He looked at Vincent standing silently in the corner. He looked at me, hoping to find a single shred of paternal mercy. He found absolutely nothing. Vanessa broke first. She did not even bother reading the intricate legal paragraphs. She just wanted to escape the room and avoid prison. She grabbed the heavy metal pen and flipped straight to the signature pages. She signed the non-disclosure agreement. She signed the permanent restraining order. She pushed the papers away from her, breathing heavily. Cameron watched her sign. He realized he was entirely alone in the world. He picked up his pen. His hand was trembling so violently he could barely keep the tip on the paper. He signed his name on the non-disclosure agreement, sealing his mouth shut forever. He signed the restraining order, banishing himself from his family permanently. Finally, he pulled the thick assumption of debt contract toward him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the massive 6-figure number printed on the page. Then he pressed the pen down and signed his life away. Vincent walked forward and collected the documents. He checked every single signature line, making sure the ink was clear and the dates were correct. He stamped them with his official notary seal, binding them into permanent legal reality. I stood at the head of the table and watched the ink dry on the thick white paper. A profound sense of relief washed over my shoulders. The toxic, exhausting weight I had been carrying for 5 long years simply evaporated. I was no longer an emotional hostage. I was no longer a human bank account for 2 ungrateful parasites. The financial umbilical cord had been severed days ago, but this was the final psychological amputation. The parasitic bond was permanently dead. I had successfully excised the infection from my life, and I had done it without firing a single shot. I did not simply trust them to honor the legal agreements they had just signed in the conference room. Trust is a luxury reserved for honest people, and neither Cameron nor his former bride had ever earned that classification. The moment the lawyer packed the signed documents into his leather briefcase, I initiated the next phase of their exile. I had already contacted a private security firm earlier that morning. They were a highly specialized group composed entirely of former military personnel who handled discreet corporate extractions and high-risk evictions. I paid them a premium rate to ensure the physical removal of my son and the woman who ruined him from the city limits. I walked out of the legal building and went straight home. I did not want to watch the pathetic process of them packing their miserable belongings. The security team handled the manual labor of intimidation. I received hourly updates on my encrypted phone from the detail commander. He reported that they escorted the broken couple back to the cheap roadside motel. The atmosphere inside room 112 was reportedly absolute poison. The commander told me that they did not exchange a single word while they shoved their clothes into their suitcases. The silence between them was heavier than the cinderblock walls of the cheap room. The woman was the first to break the physical proximity. She did not ask Cameron for a ride or offer to help him figure out his massive new debt. She simply grabbed her bags, walked out to the highway, and hailed a passing taxicab. The security detail split into 2 vehicles. One followed the taxi. They tracked her all the way to the downtown bus terminal. My phone buzzed with a photograph sent by the commander. It showed her standing in line at the ticket counter, wearing oversized sunglasses indoors, trying to hide the red mark on her cheek, where the reality of her choices had finally struck her. She purchased a one-way economy ticket heading out west toward the desert. She boarded the massive diesel vehicle dragging her heavy bags down the narrow aisle and sat in the very back row. The security team watched the bus pull out of the station and merge onto the interstate, carrying her permanently out of our lives. She left my son behind in a cheap motel without a single goodbye or a backward glance. Cameron was now entirely isolated. He had no wife, no apartment, no career, and no father to bail him out. But he did have the crushing weight of a $150,000 loan secured at a predatory secondary market interest rate. The monthly minimum payments alone were astronomical. He could no longer rely on his useless marketing degree or his network of wealthy friends who had immediately abandoned him the second the startup fired him. His reputation in the financial district was completely destroyed. The reality of his situation demanded immediate brutal action simply to avoid defaulting and facing the aggressive collection tactics of the lending company. He had to trade his polished leather shoes for steel-toed work boots. Within 48 hours of signing the assumption of debt contract, Cameron applied for the only job that would hire him immediately without a rigorous corporate background check. He became a warehouse associate at a massive regional fulfillment center located in the grim industrial sector of the county. It was a facility known for grueling shifts, relentless physical quotas, and a massive turnover rate among employees. 2 weeks passed. The silence in my home remained absolute and perfectly unbroken. The legal firewalls held strong, and the non-disclosure agreements kept my name completely out of the local gossip circles. But the mind of a structural engineer always requires visual confirmation that a load-bearing structure is holding the correct amount of weight. I needed to see the final result of the catastrophic collapse I had engineered. It was a late Tuesday afternoon when I decided to take a drive. The weather had turned incredibly hostile. A freezing gray rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets, washing the color out of the suburban streets. I drove my truck out toward the industrial park, navigating through the maze of chain-link fences and massive concrete loading docks. I did not drive onto the fulfillment center property. I parked my vehicle on the opposite side of the 4-lane road, pulling into the empty lot of a closed-down diner. I turned off the engine but left the heat running. I rolled down my passenger side window just a fraction of an inch to let the cold air inside, and I watched the main employee exit. The afternoon shift change occurred at exactly 5 o'clock. A loud mechanical buzzer echoed across the wet asphalt. The heavy metal doors of the warehouse slid open, and a stream of exhausted workers poured out into the freezing rain. They were all wearing identical high-visibility yellow vests, moving with the slow, heavy steps of people who had been standing on hard concrete for 10 straight hours. I scanned the crowd through the rain-streaked glass of my truck. It took me several minutes to find him, but my eyes eventually locked onto a familiar face in the crowd. It was Cameron. He looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant executive who had tried to host a wedding on my private lawn just weeks ago. His posture was completely broken. The designer suits and the expensive silk ties were gone. He was wearing cheap, faded denim work pants and a flimsy, clear plastic poncho over his high-visibility vest. He was not walking toward a luxury sedan to drive to a warm apartment. He was pushing a heavy, rusted pallet jack across the uneven pavement of the loading dock, trying to secure a stack of wooden crates before the freezing rain warped the cardboard boxes. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his shoulders were hunched against the biting cold wind. I watched him struggle with the sheer physical weight of the loaded pallet. The wheels of the jack caught on a deep pothole filled with freezing water. The massive load shifted dangerously. Cameron had to throw his entire body weight against the heavy wooden crates, digging his boots into the slippery asphalt, just to keep the merchandise from toppling over into the mud. He was straining, gasping for air, his face twisted in physical exertion and sheer misery. A supervisor holding a waterproof clipboard stood on the elevated concrete dock and yelled something down at him, pointing angrily at his watch. Cameron did not argue back. He did not puff out his chest or throw his name around to demand respect. He simply lowered his head, nodded submissively in the pouring rain, and pushed harder against the frozen metal handle of the pallet jack. The unearned arrogance had been physically beaten out of him by the relentless, crushing reality of minimum wage labor. Every single dollar he earned pushing that heavy equipment in the freezing cold would immediately be consumed by the massive loan interest he brought upon himself. I sat in the warm cabin of my truck and watched him work for another 10 minutes. I searched my heart for a single trace of regret. I looked deep inside myself for the familiar ache of paternal pity that used to force me to open my wallet every time he stumbled. I found absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest where that blind, unconditional forgiveness used to live was entirely empty. What I felt instead was the precise, cold, and profound satisfaction of a complex mathematical equation finally achieving perfect balance. For years he had floated above the ground, suspended by my money and my sacrifices, completely unaware of the gravity of the real world. Now he was finally standing on his own 2 feet, feeling the true punishing weight out of his own terrible decisions. He was paying off the debt he had forged, using his own physical sweat and his own agonizing labor. The scales of justice were perfectly aligned, and the architecture of consequence was flawless. I rolled the passenger window back up, sealing out the sound of the rain and the industrial noise of the warehouse. I shifted my truck into drive. I pulled out of the abandoned parking lot and merged smoothly onto the main road, heading back toward the quiet warmth of my own home. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the gray horizon stretching out in front of me. I did not glance at the side mirror, and I never looked in the rearview mirror even once. The air up at the lake is always different in the late autumn. It carries a sharp, clean bite that clears the lungs and sharpens the mind. I woke up at 5 in the morning without the aid of an alarm clock. The house was entirely silent. I walked into the kitchen of my lakeside cabin and began my morning routine. I measured the dark roasted coffee beans and listened to the low mechanical grind of the machine. I poured the hot water and watched the dark liquid fill my favorite ceramic mug. I did not check my phone for emergency text messages. I did not brace myself for the sound of an angry pounding at my front door. Those days were permanently over. I carried my coffee mug through the living room and pushed open the heavy glass door leading out to the back deck. I stepped onto the restored wooden porch and took a deep breath. The morning mist was still rolling heavily off the surface of the freezing water, obscuring the opposite shoreline in a blanket of pale gray. I looked out over my property. The sloping lawn that led down to the water was completely pristine. The deep, muddy trenches carved by the fleeing vehicles of the ruined wedding had been entirely filled and leveled. I had hired a local landscaping crew to lay down fresh green sod and plant a new row of young apple trees along the perimeter. There was absolutely no physical evidence that a chaotic stampede had ever taken place on my land. The soil was healed, and the property was whole again. The financial healing was equally absolute. Just yesterday, I received a thick, certified envelope from the county clerk's office. Vincent had executed his legal threats with ruthless efficiency. The predatory lending company that approved the fraudulent mortgage had absolutely panicked when they realized they were facing a federal wire fraud conspiracy charge. They did not try to fight us in civil court. They did not try to negotiate a partial settlement. They immediately folded under the pressure of federal exposure. The lending directors completely scrubbed the $150,000 lien from my property title. They absorbed the administrative costs, and they legally severed all ties to my lakeside cabin. My deed was entirely clean and firmly back in my personal name. To ensure my permanent silence, the lending company had even paid a substantial out-of-court settlement for their gross negligence in verifying the forged signature. The cabin was completely secure. It was once again the untouchable retirement sanctuary that I had built with my late wife, Diane. I walked over to the heavy wooden rocking chair positioned at the edge of the porch and sat down. I set my coffee mug on the small side table and picked up my digital tablet. I unlocked the screen. I did not open any social media applications. I had no interest in the outside world or the toxic opinions of strangers. I opened a secure administrative portal. The screen illuminated, displaying the official logo of the newly established Diane Cole Foundation. When Cameron signed over his 15% equity in the technology startup, he had no idea how rapidly the corporate landscape was shifting. Less than a month after his termination, the startup was acquired by a massive global technology conglomerate. The initial public offering was bypassed entirely in favor of a highly aggressive cash buyout. That 15% equity stake instantly converted into a massive liquid fortune. I did not need millions of dollars. I already owned my properties outright, and my retirement was fully funded. I did not want to buy luxury cars or take extravagant vacations. I wanted to build a fortress. I took every single dollar of that corporate buyout and poured it directly into the creation of a private charitable organization dedicated entirely to the protection of vulnerable seniors. I scrolled through the active case files on my tablet. The foundation was designed to provide elite, ruthless legal representation for elderly individuals who were actively being targeted by financial predators. We did not offer simple advice or gentle mediation. We offered overwhelming legal firepower. I had hired a team of aggressive corporate litigators trained directly by Vincent Gallagher. They were currently hunting down predatory relatives, greedy grandchildren, and fraudulent caregivers who thought they could easily steal from the elderly. I clicked on the first file. It detailed the case of a 70-year-old widow living in the city. Her nephew had convinced her to sign over the deed to her home under the guise of helping her manage her property taxes. Once his name was on the paper, he immediately tried to evict her and sell the house to a commercial developer, leaving her entirely homeless. Before the foundation existed, that woman would have been thrown out onto the street with no resources to fight back. But my legal team had intervened exactly 48 hours ago. They slapped the nephew with a massive civil lawsuit, froze all of his personal bank accounts, and placed an emergency injunction on the property sale. They were currently dismantling his life piece by piece until he surrendered the deed back to his aunt. I read the summary of the injunction and felt a profound sense of purpose. I was taking the exact tactical blueprint I had used to destroy the parasites in my own life, and I was weaponizing it for others. The money that Cameron had foolishly forfeited was now actively funding the destruction of men exactly like him. It was a beautiful poetic justice. I had turned a personal betrayal into a permanent shield for the innocent. I was honoring the memory of my wife not by crying over her lost medical documents, but by ensuring her name became synonymous with absolute protection and legal retribution. I closed the case file and turned off the tablet screen. I set the device down next to my coffee mug. The electronic work was done for the morning. I leaned back in the wooden rocking chair and looked out at the water. The silence surrounding me was deep and absolute. It was not the lonely, terrifying silence of a man who had lost his family. It was the rich, rewarding silence of a man who had successfully defended his castle. There were no more demands for emergency cash transfers. There were no more entitled screams echoing through my hallways. There were no more lies disguised as familial love. I had surgically excised a massive toxic tumor from my daily existence. The recovery process was complete, and the patient was entirely cured. I reached over and picked up my mug. The ceramic was warm against my palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark, bitter coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Across the lake, the morning sun finally broke through the heavy cloud cover. The bright golden light crested the top of the dark pine trees, casting long, beautiful shadows across the freezing water. The thick gray mist began to burn away, revealing the clear blue sky underneath. The air grew slightly warmer. A flock of small birds landed in the newly planted apple trees, chirping quietly as they settled into the branches to build their nests. I closed my eyes and let the morning sun warm my face. I did not wonder where my son was. I did not care if he was pushing heavy machinery in the freezing rain to pay off his massive debts. I did not wonder what distant state his former wife had fled to. They were entirely erased from my reality. I had paid my dues, and I had balanced the scales of justice with my own two hands. The adjustment was silent. The adjustment was total. The adjustment was permanent. I was finally at peace, and the rest of my life belonged entirely to me. If there is one lesson to take away from this entire ordeal, it is that true love should never be confused with endless enabling. For years, I believed that providing financial support was my duty as a father, even when it was met with blatant disrespect and ungratefulness. I learned the hard way that when you subsidize a person's arrogance, you are not helping them build a successful life. You are simply financing your own abuse. Real family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, not financial dependency. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer someone is the absolute consequence of walking away. If you believe that respect must be earned and boundaries must be fiercely defended, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with toxic family members in the comments below.